Our world is changing. Every day, it changes a little faster. Some changes are too small to see. Others, too big to handle. Sometimes, change feels slow. So slow, we don't even notice. Other times, it happens all at once, and we can't keep up. For our climate, change means many things. And between too small to see and too big to handle, there is a whole world of difference. The clock is ticking. This is Bloomberg Green.
2020 is set to be the hottest year on record. This week, heat affects everyone, but the poorest are hit the hardest. Why rising temperatures create rising inequity. On the front line of a climate crisis, Australian drought strips millions of access to water. What can we learn from the government response and businesses? Plus, he spent 8 years as the top science advisor at the White House. John Holdren tells us how we can get the U.S. climate plan back on track. From Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, I'm Kailey Leinz. This is Bloomberg Green. It's one of the hottest, driest places on Earth, and the strain on Australia's environment is making the problem even worse. We traveled through some of the hardest hit areas of the country to see how drought affects business, government, and the people who live there.
I'm really interested in how people are experiencing and adapting to climate change. It's no longer something hypothetical. It's no longer something that we can worry about in the future. It's happening right now. And there's nowhere where that's more true than Australia. The warming world will mean there is less water to go around, and that is going to put huge stress on the mechanisms by which water is allocated and shared.
I traveled earlier this year to the Murray-Darling region of Australia, which is the country's agricultural heartland. It's named for two of Australia's most important rivers, the Murray and the Darling, which converge at the border of New South Wales and Victoria. Together, they and their tributaries are a critical source of fresh water. 3 million people drink it every day, while another 40 million rely on it for food. Although it's remote from glittering coastal cities like Sydney and Melbourne, the Murray-Darling has long been at the vanguard of Australia's economy.
What is changing now is, of course, the climate. The dry periods are getting drier.
One of those affected is Gus White, a farmer who runs livestock, mostly sheep, on 31,000 hectares of land. He drove me across his farm and gave me an idea of how his life has been affected.
Yeah, there is not a drop of water in that landscape right now.
No.
There's a completely dry lake bed. That would have been water some years ago, and a lot of people around here would like it to be water again, but unless there is serious rain and changes in the way that this watershed are managed, that's just not going to happen.
A couple of hours' drive from Gus's farm, I met another local who's been suffering the consequences of water shortages and has become an advocate for changing how water is managed, Rob McBride. He's the owner of Talarno Station, a vast ranch on the banks of the Darling that dates to the early years of European settlement.
Our family's been here about 80 years. We've been farming in Australia for about 167. The river is everything. It always has been, from the Buckhingie down to us, that we all know how important that is. And with the destruction that's happened on our river system, I've never seen it look like this. It's a desert. 80% of our population lives in 3 cities. They have no idea what's going on here. And we have real problems.
The problems McBride is referring to go beyond the effects of climate change on the rivers. He believes the immediate cause of the crisis in the Murray-Darling is more specific: unsustainable water use by large, well-funded agribusiness groups, who he says are taxing an already stressed system to the point of no return. One of the fastest growing users of water in recent years have been almond farms. Select Harvest's almond orchard at Bunargool on the Murray River is one of the larger ones. The irrigation system at Bunargool is outfitted with industrial pumps that can each pull 330 liters of water per second from the Murray River. They run for up to 18 hours a day. That leaves a lot less for others reliant on water in the area. Almond farms are able to use this much water thanks to Australia's water trading system, which is designed to allocate water to the highest economic return. Companies and farmers can buy the rights to pump specific amounts of water, with the prices set by the market. Because almond farms are generally quite profitable, they can afford it. Almonds require a lot of water to grow. One study of growing conditions in California estimated that it takes more than 6 liters per almond, and the company plans to scale up production. I asked Select Harvest's managing director whether he thinks the almond industry can keep growing as water becomes more difficult to obtain. He prefers to think of the question in a different way.
Some people will say, are you using less water or more water? That's the wrong question. The question is, are you producing more per megalitre? And we are.
I pressed him further on the continued effects of climate change on the industry. He said,
We're wonderful beasts.
Yeah.
We give ways out of this stuff.
a big part of Australia's national myth is built on overcoming nature, and there's sometimes a reluctance to recognize that the environment will eventually reach its limits. This sentiment goes further than agribusiness executives.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
Australia's Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has downplayed the effects of climate change, notably during the bushfires that began ravaging the country in late 2019.
The Prime Minister has declared any link between Australia's climate change policies and the current bushfires doesn't stand up to reason.
Environmentalists believe the people of the Murray-Darling need to have a wide-ranging discussion about what the environment can support.
Whether the trajectory will change, I don't know. That's in large part a political question. There is a general election in Australia in a couple of years. If there is a change in government, that could lead to a change in the parameters of management of the river system. But I think for now, things are probably going to continue as they have. While it is in many ways a uniquely Australian story, it's also coming to a cinema near you. More and more places in the world are going to be water stressed as the planet heats up, and so there are certainly lessons, positive and negative, to be drawn from the Australian experience.
Just as the impact of climate change affects different parts of the planet more intensely, it also hits harder on certain parts of our society. Coming up, we look at the link between rising temperatures and rising inequality. Plus, the UK is banning gasoline car sales by 2030. We break down Britain's 10 steps to carbon neutrality next. This is Bloomberg Green. I'm Kailey Leinz in New York. This is Bloomberg Green. For the climate news you need to know this week, Jennifer Zabazaja has your Green in Brief.
France's largest glacier is shrinking, and fast, relatively speaking. In the last 100 years, it's lost a third of its volume. That's the equivalent of more than 500,000 Olympic swimming pools of ice. And scientists think the trend will continue. By the end of the century, glaciers in the Alps could be 90% smaller. The Trump administration's environmental plans could complicate President-elect Biden's pledge to go green. The White House is rushing to sell the rights to Arctic drilling and finalize major new climate regulations. Some of the moves would make it harder for the next president to impose stricter environmental rules. And there's an effort to make global trade greener. About 90% of the world's goods are moved by ship, and the sector spews as much CO2 as Germany and France combined. Now the global regulator is looking at rules to clean up the industry and improve carbon efficiency. And that's your Green Brief.
UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has unveiled a 10-point plan he calls a green industrial revolution. Among those points is a ban on new gasoline vehicle sales by 2030 and the promise of hundreds of thousands of jobs in a global hub for green finance in London. Bloomberg Green executive editor Aaron Redkoff is here with more. Aaron, what are some of the key points of the plan we need to know?
Well, as you mentioned, the restriction on sales of internal combustion vehicles at 2030, which is one of the earliest dates set in the world so far. There's a lot of money and drive behind renewable power, especially wind energy for the UK. There's money being put into emerging clean energy technologies like battery technology that will be developed in the UK, which would be something new. Drive into hydrogen, which is one of the clean energy frontiers that there's going to be a lot of work on. So a lot of those things are very strong parts of the plan.
Yeah, and they're ambitious and extensive, but do they go far enough? Is the UK actually going to meet the goals it's setting here?
Well, that's the interesting thing. Right now, the UK's own climate committee finds that they're not on target currently to meet their 2030 goals. So these are goals or policies driving towards a more distant horizon in 2050, but there's reason to question whether any of it will bring them to where they need to be, which is a policy of net zero emissions by 2050. Analysts from BNF today took a look at the report. Again, this is an early outline. It's not a full policy paper by any means. But what they concluded is that no, these would not be enough to get the UK to that zero target by 2050. And there's a question of how much money is being put in here. If you look at this plan compared to others in Europe even, the resources appear to be smaller, even on the scale of things like the commitment to hydrogen investment. I mean, that's smaller than some of the UK's peers.
And can we draw a parallel between what the UK is doing and what we might be able to expect to see from the incoming Biden administration?
Well, that's one of the really interesting overlaps here, and it's a pattern we're beginning to see emerge, when we look at these plans across the board. Joe Biden says during his campaign, when I talk about climate, I talk about jobs, and Boris Johnson has a very similar approach here, right? A lot of the discussion of what's in this plan is both about why it's good for the global climate perspective, but also why it's good for workers in the UK, why stimulating these green parts of the economy or clean energy by having batteries produced inside of the UK, by having the UK emerge as a hydrogen power leader, why these things are advantageous for workers in the UK.
All right, many thanks to Aaron Redkoff. He is Bloomberg Green executive editor. From South America to Africa and South Asia, countries on the equator are set to see soaring temperatures and with it, soaring inequality. Bloomberg looks at how climate change might hit the most vulnerable and what other nations can do to help.
Killer heat is here. How many of us will die from extreme heat in the decades ahead?
Our central estimate is that the temperature-related mortality impacts of climate change are 10 to 20 times larger than had previously been understood.
Researchers at the Climate Impact Lab spent years aggregating data on temperature, income, and mortality. What they found is that more than anything else, your future risk of dying from heat is determined by where you live and the impacts of today's economic inequality.
In today's poor places, the impacts of climate change are going to manifest themselves in substantial, meaningful increases in mortality. In contrast, even at similar climate zones, in rich countries, people are going to spend a lot protecting themselves.
Income growth and the climate adaptation it drives could reduce projected heat-related mortality rates by 60%. That translates into millions of lives.
A lot of the places that are relatively well positioned for climate change got there through lots of fossil fuel consumption. What is at the heart of the tension on the climate challenge is that different societies are going to see a trade-off between climate protection and the need for income growth.
Extreme heat has been linked to a 50% mortality risk from stroke, cardiovascular disease, and pulmonary conditions. And the last 6 years have been the hottest ever recorded. This century has brought shocking heat-related death tolls: 70,000 in Europe in 2003, 56,000 in Russia in 2010, and 12,000 people die prematurely of heat in the U.S. each year. Meanwhile, carbon emissions continue to rise.
The release of an additional ton of CO2 is projected to cause about $36.60 of temperature-related mortality damages. And if instead the world were to follow a kind of a more moderate emissions scenario, then that number decreases to about $17. This report that we released is just about temperature change. The full social cost of carbon would of course include the damages associated with crops, labor productivity, sea level rise, and on and on and on, all dimensions of human well-being.
Putting a price on emissions is crucial in understanding how to mitigate them and create the political will to do so.
A major advance in what we've done and what we're doing is to produce estimates at the hyper-local level. Our theory is that by providing information in that hyper-localized way, people will be able to better connect to it and, in principle, demand more political action.
Economy versus environment. It doesn't need to be a choice. Up next, we hear from John Holdren, who spent 8 years as the top science advisor at the White House and has worked his entire life fighting global warming. This is Bloomberg Green.
We see an opportunity here to have a recovery in 2021 that is green.
We need to invest now.
There's no planet B. Sometimes in business you have a plan B for something if plan A doesn't work. In our planet Earth, there's no planet B.
We need to use our recovery stimulus to invest in the clean and digital technologies of the future.
The technologies aren't available here yet today, but they'll be here 2, 3, 4 years from now.
From New York City, I'm Kailey Leinz. This is Bloomberg Green. Well, as nations start to take action on emissions, a long history has led us to where we are. So where did all the CO2 come from? Here are the numbers behind the biggest emitters.
The climate change blame game. China is the biggest net polluter in the world today, but the country with the most emissions per capita is the tiny island nation of Palau in the Pacific Ocean. So who should shoulder the responsibility for making a difference? One way of looking at the problem is historical emissions, and it paints a clearer image of countries' impact on the climate over time. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe was responsible for nearly all CO2 emissions across the globe. Post-industrial America became the lead polluter by the 20th century, before rapidly developing China took its place at the top of the list in the last 30 years. It wasn't Europe and America reducing their emissions that dropped them down to scale, merely China producing so much more. And that becomes clear when you chart the total emissions by different nations. The US is responsible for 25% of all emissions, shunting the European Union, plus the UK, into second place. Meanwhile, though China produced the most CO2 last year, it's responsible for less than 13% of the historical total. But if it continues to emit at current levels, it will catch up, producing a century of U.S. emissions in less than 40 years. So, whose problem is it? Simply put, it's everyone's responsibility, even if rich countries have to do more. And what groups, companies, and politicians are starting to realize is that regardless of how the pie is sliced, the world will be required to work together to find the solution.
For many, threats associated with climate change are becoming more real, but for a few, fighting global warming has been a life's work. As President Obama's scientific advisor, Dr. John Holdren was the intellectual powerhouse of the administration's climate policies.
It is still possible to avoid the worst impacts of future climate change if the world acts together and acts now.
He was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship known as a Genius Grant. He spent his career studying causes and consequences of our changing environment. 2 decades at the University of California, Berkeley, and 13 years at Harvard. He's also served in public office and was a key force behind the U.S. joining the Paris Agreement. So where does Holdren see U.S. leadership on the environment and the future of climate action?
I think the Biden climate plan is superb. It's a terrific advance. It builds on what we were able to do in the Obama administration in the Climate Action Plan. It builds on what we were able to get done in the Paris Agreement. And it is very sensibly focused not just on making progress on the climate change challenge, but doing it in a way that creates jobs, that creates economic opportunity, that addresses injustices, that gives priority to protecting the most vulnerable populations from the impacts of climate change. I think it's a really sensible policy.
But seeing many of the environmental policies he worked on rolled back under President Trump, John Holdren has been outspoken in his criticism. One of his main points of contention has been what he called the hollowing out of top talent at government agencies. His former workplace, the Office of Science and Technology, was reduced from 135 staff to 30 overnight.
I do not see any irreversible damage that Trump has been able to do, but I see some forms of damage that will take quite a long time to reverse. On the first day that Biden and Harris are in office in the White House, I think their highest priority is actually going to be to install absolutely first-rate people in all the key positions. There is nothing more important in getting things done in the federal government than having smart, capable, dedicated people in the key positions.
President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris have made diversity a linchpin of their transition team.
I said at the outset, I wanted to represent this campaign to represent and look like America. We've done that. Now that's what I want the administration to look like and act like.
46% of the transition staff are people of color, and the majority of the staff, 52%, are women.
Obama liked to say, you can't win the game with half the team on the bench. And he was referring to the fact that women are underrepresented in science, technology, engineering, and math. A wide variety of minority groups are underrepresented. And one of my responsibilities was to work with other White House offices and departments and agencies in addressing that shortfall. And again, I am absolutely confident that that Biden and Harris will restore that part of the priorities that we had in the Obama administration. It's not that that's all they'll do.
While the Trump administration said the choice is between the economy and fighting climate change,
I'm not going to lose that wealth. I'm not going to lose it on dreams, on windmills.
Joe Biden has emphasized the opposite.
It's not only a crisis, it's an enormous opportunity.
John Holdren says there's a solution that benefits everybody.
We can fix this. We can drastically reduce the amount of harm to come with investments that will create jobs, that will create wealth, that will create opportunity. It's a matter of the economy and the environment working together to underpin human prosperity. And when that is done, we're all going to be better off. We can have a win-win if only we make sensible choices.
But the government can't do it on its own. It's going to take buy-in from companies.
This is not a problem that the government is going to solve by itself, and it's not going to solve the problem over the dead bodies of the private sector. It's going to solve it in cooperation with the private sector. And again, I think President-elect Biden is the sort of consensus builder who will be able to help get that done.
That wraps it up for this week. To keep the conversation going, follow us on Twitter @Climate. In New York, I'm Kailey Leinz. This is Bloomberg Green.